at me. Actually, everyone I think was laughing at me. Yeah, so here we are. Um, Although before we jump into today, I do like to do a quick little sort of recap and offer one more opportunity for people to ask some questions, get some clarification on anything we did the day before, and also an interesting opportunity if you tried some of the stuff we talked about yesterday with the compression, if you noticed anything, had some success or failure or whatever. So any sort of, looking back over the last couple of days, comments, questions, or thoughts before we move forward? I don't know, Jaleesa, are you talking? Because you're muted, but.
I'm so sorry. I'm just singing. Like, I promise
Oh,
you.
that's fine. No, that's
Yeah,
fine. Okay. I wasn't sure if you were asking me a question.
yeah, my bad.
All right, cool. Okay, well, that's good from my perspective because the less questions to clarify what I covered means I explained it pretty good. So that's fine with me. I'm not necessarily expecting questions. I just like to offer that up before we start to move on. So, again, what we've been doing here is going through this process of thinking like a mix engineer to try to compartmentalize the few steps, adding some tips, some tricks, some ways of understanding some of the tools a little better, using some of the tools in different ways, some more advanced ways, and also, helping us, ideally create some better mixes at home, right? So that's the course of the class. So up until this point, we've talked about setting up our environment, doing some calibration, getting the sonar works to help make sure what we're listening to is solid, utilizing some reference tracks to help provide a frequency target. Then we did some initial mix prep. We talked about a little bit of releveling initially, especially when having problems with the mix, that bass management where we're sort of removing what we don't need down there, the emphasis on what we do need, monoing the stuff that's the low end that's going to be down there. Um, and then yesterday we talked about the dynamic control aspect of kind of what would traditionally come next. The sort of, basic theory is that compress first, then EQ. Now, those rules are uh, a sort of a standard, but it's, sometimes, I mean, we did some EQ first by taking out that low end, and then we did the compression, and then we would probably now move on to doing more frequency based um, where that sound is supposed to be, adjusting the frequencies in there with EQ, which is what we're going to now talk about today. So I would venture to say that an EQ is probably the type of tool that everybody is most familiar with, because by the time we've reached this point in our production career, we've messed with lots of different EQs, starting with bass, mids, and treble, even just growing up on our sound systems at home, or my first DJ setup, or whatever the case may be. Um, so, and then in addition to that, when we think about the creative stage here, oftentimes there's a significant amount of adjusting frequencies involved in sound design, in especially if you're trying to create some sort of a weird sound. So you might be doing some heavier handed EQing to shape the frequencies in the sound design phase. And when I think about the mixing um, aspect to applying EQ and thinking about the frequencies and all that, it kind of comes down to a more subtle approach on many occasions, and a lot of times it's doing some subtle things a little bit to a lot of tracks that really start to like have things take shape. What I'm always going for is a sound that's like warm and comforting, tight and together in the low end, sounds fat, mid-range presence, but not harshness, and brightness and feels nice and airy and open, but not harsh or pointy or, um, you know, um, having a nice type of high end that's appropriate, and also a very defined and clear low end. And it's that defined and clear low end that that step one happens a couple steps ago, when we did that, removing everything out of the way to really be able to focus our efforts to the elements that we do want there, and be able to address those without the clutter of the, excess little low end that was coming across a whole bunch of tracks. So we're heading in that direction. The interesting thing about this idea, as I've sort of presented this class through the years in various workshops and private sessions, um, a lot of the concepts sort of transcend any sort of genre. It's like at the end of the day, harsh mid-range doesn't matter if you're making a rock song, a techno song, future-based song, or whatever the case may be. Too much low end is still too much low end. Whether the genre is even, dubstep, there can be too much low end, although that, it takes a lot to do that. But the point is that achieving a balanced frequency response and translating good frequencies across multiple sound systems and stuff that sounds good, I would venture to say is wider than some people think in terms of, good sound is good sound. And so, um, we think about these concepts and ideas when we think about the frequencies being broader than just making a house track per se, because, these, a good sounding song is a good sounding song regardless. And it's about that balance between the low, mids, and highs, that we can get there. One of the things that helps is setting that frequency destination or the reference tracks where we talked about level matching them, and sort of having that as an additional tool to help calibrate our listening, picking those songs that we like, we think we would be happy if our stuff sounded like that, level matching them to make sure they're really relevant to what we're working on, level and matching them to our song as we're working to help provide this frequency roadmap. So I can, teach you, and you could, study how to use an EQ day and night. But if you're not properly calibrated in terms of potentially reference Sonarworks, if you don't really know what good music is supposed to sound like, and it can be hard to sort of hit that target regardless, right? So we want to be able to utilize those other aspects to help us when we then dive into actually applying and shaping the frequencies using EQ. There's a couple of different ways that I think about um, using EQ. Um, and oh yeah, also just a quick little monitoring levels reminder, which I talked about on that day one. The idea around setting an accurate SPL or accurate listening level was that the ear hears flattest in that sort of, upper 70s area for like a smaller room, more like a, speakers being close to you type scenario. Uh, and that relates here because when we're talking about making frequency adjustments to hi-hat, snares, claps, and, elements, vocals, or whatever the case may be, we want to be making that as informed as possible. So, a decent listening environment, all the stuff we talked about on day one starts to take effect here when we now are really starting to apply things like EQ. And there's a couple ways that I apply EQ and sort of separate them out in the way that I'll talk about them today. There's the overall tone shaping and shifting of, one aspect of that is, just some sort of, rebalancing. Sometimes the high frequency elements, I can do that with level, and sometimes I can use like shelving EQs and things like that just to sort of overall shape. And there's this idea in this sort of mixing engineer mind, like I talked about, is a way to not only have parts sound their best individually, but also as a group, in relation to all the other sounds, all the other frequencies coming from all the other tracks, right? And so we definitely are going to spend a lot of our time in this step thinking about how these individual elements not only sound great on their own, but also their interaction frequency wise with everything else, and how that all now comes together and makes a defined, very good finished product. I also do that low end cleanup, which hopefully we already did a couple steps ago, but we'll talk a little bit more even about that today. And then there's this overall now low end balancing act that when I think about the amount of time that I spend, I do, spend a decent amount of time working in that area. And as I even mentioned already, I've been doing this a long time, and I still spend a decent amount of time per record, per mix, per master on that low end balancing act. It's always going to be something that we're achieving and striving to get better at. Sometimes some tracks will come together quick, some won't. don't be discouraged. It's, it's a never-ending sort of game we're playing here with that. My overall approach when I think about EQ is I take a removal mindset. I sort of think about the sound itself when I'm about to apply EQ, and I think about it in terms of what is it that I don't want there to add emphasis to what I do want. So it's different than listening to a sound and saying, "Oh, I want that to be brighter." I would listen to that sound and think, "Oh, I need to take away some mids to emphasize the bright." The idea behind this is that um, I guess it's theoretically in the way EQ works, the way that phase is related to adjusting frequencies and EQing, is that removal EQ sounds a bit more transparent and there's less impact on the phase relationship, or in other words, there's less impact on the phase relationship in the other areas around where we're addressing a particular EQ band. So for that sort of idea, it's commonly taught that subtractive EQ or removal EQ is the sort of way to go. Sorry. So again, that mindset is just a little bit a different way of thinking, where I sort of flip it around and I think to myself, what is it, if what do I want to emphasize on this sound, and what do I need to take away to achieve that? And so that's the basic idea that we're going to sort of approach some of today with. So um, with the idea of the removal EQ, there's a simple little concept here is that if removing, you have more leeway to be a bit narrower, but when boosting, if you are going to boost, the wider the better, if that makes sense, which we'll talk about that with and what I mean by that as we jump through some of the EQ terminologies and usage. But with that in mind, I think that if I am going to boost, then wide cues or shelves will work good. And they'll sort of play into this idea that the less detrimental phase effect when boosting comes from wider cues. Ultimately, I shoot to remove first, but if I have to boost, make it wide. It's kind of how I think about it. Now, there's a few key terms we're going to discuss. And so we just to make sure we're all on the same page, obviously the frequency is where we're going to deal with the EQ. The Q means how wide, like the width around the area we're trying to address. We do have lots of different plugins have this idea of what's called an adaptive cue. So you may have seen that or heard of it. And certainly it's here, Adapt Q in the Ableton EQ, Logic EQs has something very, very similar. And basically what this talks about is that the more you boost or remove, the narrower the cue gets sort of towards the bottom. So just to give you a quick example of that, if I just open up the EQ8 on anything and turn this on. Sorry, I put that into our little rack that I had for some reason. Okay, so with Adapt Q on and this band wherever I make it, as I get, you see how it's getting narrower as I dip more, and as I boost more, it gets narrower. So that's just what adaptive Q is. It's also meant to be sort of like kind of from the analog world. It's a way that EQ sounds, good. So that's why they include it. But that's what it does, basically, as a point of reference for the terminology. Gain is how much we're adding or taking away. And then shelves adjust a larger portion, either above or below. So we look at this shelf here, our channel 4. Oh, sorry, turn that on. It's adjusting a larger portion either above or below, depending on how that works. So we're going to talk about some of these ideas, but we need to understand these parameters, I guess. So the cue control on a shelf Whereas, on a regular band, the cue controls the width, right? And that's this, standard on any EQ. The cue determines the width of uh, the frequency area you're addressing. The cue control on a shelf determines the slope at which you're addressing. So you'll notice how as I change the cue, it does this interesting slope that sort of boosts just underneath my frequency and dips just above my frequency. So it's an interesting thing to understand that process and use it to your advantage when necessary. Um, Bringing the cue in the other direction smooths out the curve. It just becomes even smoother. If I go default, we see how it's working right around where I set it. So there's a couple of things that we're going to show later about using that, but that's the idea about shelves. And like I was saying, is that if I do find myself wanting to boost the high end on something, I'll do a little bit of a shelf. If I do find myself wanting to boost the low end on something, I'll do a little bit of a shelf, just because of the nature of like the way that smooth rise of the shelf. It sort of is a less, it's a more phase coherent way of dealing with it, of dealing with a piece of audio. Just by the nature of the way EQs worked. I mean, ultimately, like when people made analog EQs, they took two circuits, and as you changed the knob, they adjusted the phase between the two, because as you hopefully know, and if not, I'll just say really quickly that if two pieces of music or a piece of music is exactly opposite or out of phase, it will cancel out. So what they were doing in analog EQs was adjusting the phase. So you're taking away a certain frequency was actually moving it out of phase to one another, to the point where you were taking it all the way out when it's really out of phase, so working opposite to one another. And so that's like the origins of EQ, and that sort of idea has carried through even into the digital realm, although we also now have things like linear phase EQs, and we will cover that a little bit and what it's all about. So yeah, so these are just, showing some of the points that I mentioned and referenced above in terms of the cue settings on shelves, the cue settings on various bands, and all of that, and how that works. So, all right, so once with the definition stuff, make sure we're all working off of the same defining rules. We can now start to talk about some fun stuff and some interesting stuff. And some tips and whatnot. So, what I find myself doing, and as a result, when preparing classes, I looked back at that and how that worked and how I work and what goes on in my head, how I think, and then I tried to explain that. And that's what I'm going to do today. And what that's going to encompass is a bit of a language that I've adopted that sort of helps me. And how it helps me is this language is broken up into certain frequency ranges, that a quality that I can define that then helps me narrow my approach. What I mean by that is that when I first started dealing with EQ and making music, it was a very broad approach to something that maybe was wrong. And that by that I mean that, like, I would say, oh, the low end is off, or the high end is too loud. And as through the years, as I got better and better and more narrow in my ability to hear certain frequencies, I started to associate a bit of a language to these certain frequency areas that would help guide my my approach to what I was going to EQ in those respective areas. So I'm going to use some language today that you might take away and make sense to you, and some of it might not, but the concept behind the language is also going to be important. If the language works for you, cool, but I definitely encourage you to take some of the frequencies and make your own language if you want. But in trying to translate my internal, mindset that works, it's like I'm listening to something, then I'll think to myself, oh, it sounds like a certain blah, 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 and I'll think my sort of little word, and then that sort of guides me that, like, oh, that means I probably should be searching in this frequency range or this frequency range or this frequency range. So these aren't necessarily industry standard terms. These are sort of like from my crazy brain. So one of the areas that I do find myself, and as I said, I'm going to sort of start from the bottom up, because we talked about how, we started from the bottom up, low end up in terms of that removal. to make that room. And so I'm going to start when I start thinking about these frequencies here. But when I think about the sound, and if I feel like there's too much, I sort of hear it as like boomy, or like it's by that I mean like the way like an explosion has a long tail, like it seems like long or boomy, like there's too much below 50 hertz. We're going to be already hopefully have removed once I really start to get into EQs and frequency shifting EQs. We've already kind of gotten rid of that excess that's going to occur. This is just another little reminder that we're treating that low end like the VIP room. So, everything else kind of gets out of there. And then making sure that the stuff that is there is nice and present. But if I think to myself, oh, that sounds kind of boomy, then I'll do some things to address that really low frequency area. And a couple of these tips here is that for the if I do feel like I want to put a little bottom end into something, or if I feel like something's boomy and I want to kind of rein it in, and that's kind of the way I think because the length of what I think is being boomy or that was really really low frequencies, if that's too heavy, then I feel like I have to tighten that up or kind of rein that in. And so there's this cool trick. That I do, and I guess it's kind of like if I do want to put in a little bit of low end, I'm gonna combine a shelf and a low cut or a high pass filter. And the basic idea here is that what this does is it puts a little bit of focus. If you see my example right here, where I've got um, my high pass shelf or low cut shelf, taking out some of the sub frequencies, or sorry, low cut filter, not shelf. My low cut high pass filter, taking out some of the subby or lower frequencies, but then I'm using a shelf to kind of bring all that up, and it creates that sort of centered, focused low end between this, 50 to 100 hertz type area. Um, so I think of this area as being the very translatable low end area. That 50 to 100 is the thing that's going to work on lots of subs, lots of sound systems. That's going to work really well. If I find like the emphasis of a song is below 50 hertz, this is a way that I can sort of rebalance that also, where I can use that shelf, the shelf to push a little bit of that energy between 50 and 100, but I'm backing that in using that high pass filter or the low cut filter to sort of rein in some of the really low frequencies that by nature of me using a shelf, I would be bringing those up. So this is sort of a way of sort of tilting that and creating a tighter uh, low end, but with a little bit more emphasis in a more reality based sort of region, I guess. Again, I'm using a 12 dB slope filter, setting it like around 40 to 50 hertz. So if we think about that, it's 12 dBs down at 25, right? Remember, we covered 12 dBs, half the frequency, 12 dB removal, 12 dB slope means 12's down. So I'm taking a lot away at 25 hertz, but 25 hertz is basically irrelevant. You're barely going to even feel that. It's just too long, takes too much time. Most mastering engineers are cutting out below 30 anyway. So um, this is, it's a moderate approach, but it just sort of helps rein in that lower frequency. And the combo with that and the shelf puts a little nice little roundness to it. It's a trick somebody showed me off of a Navy Q, um, where and it just was like, wow, it's great to put some focus to the low end, and the combo of the two works really, really nicely. And so I've been using this type approach a lot. So this is just a little tip on that. Um, the 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 use of this high pass filter. Oh, you know what? I think I'm going to talk about that later, but I'll cover it real quick. The use of the high pass filter on things that are supposed to be on the low end helps give it that a little bit of a tighter sound. And so I actually do have an example of this EQ. So I know we're not getting stereo sound, but like I said, I think that's probably going to be okay for us. So I think I have this EQ set on. What do I have it set on? My kick should be somewhere. I know I moved some stuff around. This is my continually working session. Here we go. So this is a pretty good example because what happens is that hopefully you can hear this even non stereo. But when I don't have any of this EQ shelf on or any of this EQ on, the uh, the kick is a pretty decent kick, but it sounds a little bit like there's two pieces to it. It's like I kind of hear the attack part or the higher frequencies first, and then because the low end also has some really low frequencies that take a long time to develop, it sounds like there's two pieces, even though it's just a continuation because of the length that's in the lower frequencies. But I hear a little bit of kind of two pieces to this kick, right? And so I'll give you that example. And then when I turn on this EQ, where I'm sort of refocusing that low end, where I'm taking out a little bit with the shelf and then boost, or taking out a little bit with the filter and then boosting a little bit with the shelf to sort of focus in the kick, it sort of pulls those two pieces together and makes it like a tighter, almost fatter sounding kick. Even though technically I'm removing some super low end, but I am boosting a little bit. But the net result is that I get a tighter, more together sounding kick. The first part without the EQ, it sounds like two pieces. They're very close together, but it's like attack first, high frequencies first, and then a little bit of the boom underneath. And then as I put this EQ on, it sort of just pulls them closer together and just makes it really much tighter and work better together. So that's the example. Hopefully you can kind of hear that. So it's more noticeable when I play with the EQ and then take it off, and I kind of start to hear two pieces versus one. Bada, 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 bada. And it just starts to slowly bring them a little bit closer together and creates a tighter kick, low end, sound. So this idea is decently exampled here on this kick. You may or may not be able to make this out over Zoom audio, but it's relevant in that this trick also works on subs and low basses and whatever the case may be. So it's this combo of using the shelf and the filter, or just even using the filter. Sometimes I'll just want like a tightness to the low end, and so I might just sort of back in this filter just a little bit that helps taper some of the really really subby stuff. And even if it is meant to be a sub, it can still sometimes sort of make it a tighter sounding sub. um, so it's a cool approach to think about. Now, we've been doing this a bit more heavy-handed with all the other elements, starting with, a few days ago, where we were bringing this up to this range, to make sure we're getting rid of that low end. But even when we do want the low end from a sound, putting a little bit of this filter can help tighten it up a little bit. And that tightening is what I mean, that the example of that kick, where if you pay close attention to it, it sort of feels like there's two pieces, and it just sort of sucks them together a little bit and gets them closer to acting like one. And that's what I mean, but when I say like, tighter low end. Um, so the next area up is a really, really awesome trick, and it's kind of like a audio illusion of sorts. But basically, this 160 hertz has an effect that, when removed, it creates the sound of a rounder low end. So if I'm listening to, for example, a kick drum or even a bass, and I feel like my definition says, "Oh, I want that to be kind of rounder," one of the first things I'll do is try a little bit of removal around this particular area. It's really weird, but it works. And when it was explained to me, I was like, "That doesn't make any sense." And then my friend was like, "Yeah, but and he did it, and I was like, that's kind of cool. This kick is a really good example of that because the what you'll be able to hear is the emphasis, and you'll hear the sound that gets removed, and it's the removal of this particular frequency that sort of just leaves us with a much more pleasing kick, more rounder, I guess. I'm going to leave this stuff on the way that I had it. Again with this kick drum here. Yeah, I can't even hear that in my headphones, but trust me, it does it. Play around with it. But here's the thing. So if you can kind of hear that emphasis sound at 160, it's like the way I describe it is it's almost like if you're pounding on an old wooden desk. Wow, you guys are probably way too young to get this, but um, like a wooden desk that like flipped up, like you see it in the old movies. But if you like pound your palm on like a hollow box, is kind of what that frequency sort of sounds like. But the net result when removing it is that it sort of opens up your ability to hear and feel the low end and not get, I guess, caught up by this more punchier sound. Yeah. Definitely hard for me to hear even in my headphones, but certainly on my speakers, this, few dBs removal in here at this sound. And I've used this trick over and over and over again. The idea here, like I said, is that it takes this sort of hollow frequency range, and by getting rid of a little bit of that hollowness, you just naturally are drawn to hearing the nice round low end. Um, and the terminology, that roundness too, I think it just makes sense when I think like, oh, I just want it to be round. It's like I just that you know hollowness is gone. It just feels fatter. So it's this weird optical illusion, but it's certainly a go-to with me when I think, like I said, when I think first off that like, oh, I want that kick to be rounder, I'll dip a little at 160 and see what happens, and then maybe try that low end trick to boost and focus the low end if I want. Um, but oftentimes, a little bit of each of these goes a long way. The next frequency area that I seem to find myself spending a lot of time in is this area between 2 and 400. This area that people refer to as like warmth, or fullness sort of comes from this area, and people talk about warmth and whatever. They sort of you know uh, referencing this sort of frequency area when people say, "Oh, it sounds warm," or "too warm," or something, whatever. But when I think about it, when there's too much frequency in this area, is I feel like I call it. It sounds to me like it's woolly, and what I mean by woolly is it like sounds like somebody put a wool sweater over my speaker, and it just seems to be like not very clear. It's kind of darker sounding, and so when I'm listening to something and my brain says, "Oh, that sounds kind of woolly and dark," it'll lead me to like, okay, I probably need to remove a little bit at this somewhere in this range. Um, one of the ideas that I've come to in the last few years is, and I think I even mentioned this already. Uh, the people that make content, and there's so much content being made in terms of sample packs, virtual instruments and sounds, and sound packs for the virtual instruments, and artist sound packs for the virtual instrument sound packs, and all that stuff. It's like everybody wants to make great sounding sounds. And, most of the time we think of people like, like we stop the track, we start playing and hit next sound, play, next sound, play, next sound, play, right? A lot of us, go through that process. Well, when soloing a sound and listening and going through a bunch of sounds, this warmth area is really influential in our then going, "Ooh, I love that sound," right? That warmth sounds wonderful. That gives us that fullness to the sound. And when we're, soloing and going through synth sounds, or soloing and scrolling through Pack on Splice, SoundCloud, or I mean, Loop Cloud, going through a sample pack, whatever the case may be. It's like, this warmth area sounds awesome and we want it. And they know that, right? So everybody's making their sounds to be really nice and full and warm in this range. What happens now is that we now start to stack, 30 and 40 sounds that were all meant to sound really full on their own. And we end up with an overabundance of this area, this low mids slash, warmth so-called area. So we can easily get a very cloudy, muddy mix. Now, me saying to a student or a client or a friend that like, oh, it sounds heavy in the low mids, is like I'm literally driving myself crazy because I'm literally saying this every single time. 90% of the time when I get a song from anybody, it's like, oh yeah, it sounds pretty good. Maybe a little heavy in the low mids. It's just such a common thing. And so it's where I really do spend a good amount of my time in sort of getting this balance in there, and how to get that right. So that puts a little bit of definition to it, a little bit of the reason to it, puts some emphasis on for you to look out for it and to listen to it. How I'm normally addressing it is kind of in this sort of using a Q of around 2 with a few dBs removal, and it's somewhere in this frequency range of 2 to 500. Of course, that there's no there's no given for that. It just depends on the sound itself. But for an example, let's see, what do I have here? I think it's one of those synth sounds that I was messing with yesterday, where we had that. Oh yeah, we set that cool distorted compressor up to give it some texture. So this was that example I think I may have mentioned when we were talking about removing the low end. Like this particular synth sound, when listening to this and scrolling through synth sounds, we see how like rich it sounds and how warm it is on this low end, which is great when I'm soloing it. And then I put it in the mix with kick drums and snares and basses and subs. And now we have this, overwhelming extra rhythm coming in these frequencies that just are already clouded by the stuff we do want there. So we talked about kind of doing that. But when I start to listen to this area, this sound is relatively clean in that area to begin with as a stem from another session. But if I put some emphasis to what I'm talking about, the frequency range I'm talking about, then you'll see and maybe can hear a little bit what I mean. So oftentimes I'll get tracks that feel like their overall mix has this element to it. And that's what I mean when I say to them, oh, it sounds like it's heavy in the low mids. And when I, take some of that away, so when I did my low end removal on this, I stopped a little bit, moderately in this 100 range. And when I dip a couple dBs here in this low mids, it's softening this mid range, and the impact of that is in relation to all the other songs. So I'm kind of soloing it just to really kind of hear more closely what we're doing. But what we do here is that it still has the roundness because that 12 dB slope filter that I talked about, that like it's not as drastic as the times 4, and so it does let a little bit of the lows in. And so when I do a little bit of this removal in the area where it starts to, if the sound felt a little bit thick there, it's it still has some of the roundness. It just doesn't have as much of the thickness in there. And so like this sound, this is a bass that has both high end and low end in it, but then we also have a kick, right? The combo of just those three elements that are meant to take up this sort of lows and lows with with this synth sound sort of blurring that line because it does have some low energy into it. They work really nice together now. Without some of the shaping on this synth, very easily could be a little bit cloudy in there. And certainly, as I start to add in more and other key sounds, more and other elements that are contributed to that low mids, that example of the fact that multiple tracks that are full sounding and warm sounding start to easily gang up and create extra emphasis in an area that's already cloudy just by the nature of the sound designers competing for our choices, I guess. Up from there, I think about an area, this 5 to 7 to me sort of comes across as honky or meaning kind of like nasally, like it has this sound that's like if somebody is talking kind of nasally and honky. And my adjustments when I'm dealing with something that my brain leads me to say, or my ears and then brain lead me to say, like, oh, this sounds kind of honky. That again, it's that initial sort of analysis of what I'm hearing, putting some language to it helps narrow down now where I'm going to go try to find what it is that I heard and then deal with it. But my approach when dealing with it, that removal approach, is I'm also usually using also about a Q of 2 or so, depending on the sound itself, but, just like I'm using at the 2 to 500 range. And then, trying to address what's happening at, the 5 to 700. And I think I have an example of that as well. Maybe not. I thought I did, but I guess I don't. I could use this same synth track just to point out how that frequency sounds and what I mean by the nasally aspect that it brings to the table that oftentimes I don't want. So that's 630. Sweeping this around from 400 to 600 or so. So that's where it starts to sound kind of nasally or honky to me. So if I'm listening to something and thinking, oh, that sounds a little bit honky, then that sort of guides me to say, oh, it's probably somewhere around in here. Let me see what happens if I, take a little bit of that away and see how it now feels, if that feels better or sounds better. Um, so as I move on up, I spend an awful lot of time in this range as well. I mean, ultimately, my class on EQ, when I first designed it many years ago before teaching a workshop and have refined it ever since, it came from I basically was like, well, let me just think about what I'm doing on a daily basis and start to come up with like some commonalities. And when I was like, oh, it seems to me I'm like constantly trying the 160 thing, spending a lot of time across multiple tracks dealing with 200 to 400 in some way. Also, so all these frequency ranges is sort of like the most common denominator of sort of areas that I'm spending my time. Um, you know, we can look online and find these frequency charts that have those overlays of saxophone, bass line, vocals, and kind of show you that. And there's plenty of that information out there. I sort of like wanted to say like, here's like straight from my mixing studio, the stuff I hear, why I hear it, what it seems to do, what I don't like about it, how I approach it, and what it sounds like. So it's sort of this combo of like helping you train your ear a little bit by putting some language, emphasizing some of those frequencies, so you can start to kind of hear what I mean, and then and just sort of looked at areas that I just was often messing with across multiple genres, multiple songs, mixing, mastering, my own stuff, other people's stuff, and started to define what it was about those areas and all of that. So, that, anyway, I don't know if I said that already, but so from 2K to 4K, they say the ear is the most sensitive around 4K. Uh, and so harshness is very easily apparent there because we are hearing, very sensitive around that area. So harshness kind of lives in this area. And so I think to myself, oh, that sounds a little bit harsh. My definition of harsh, right? Um, then that sort of guides me to sort of look at what's happening to 3K, 4K, somewhere right around in there. Um, Certainly, things like vocals, certainly contemporary vocals are pretty soft in this 2 to 4K range. They're definitely going to have their presence, but it's the air and high frequency, and then they have a nice sort of a smoother sound in this sort of what I call harsher area. Um, the settings for removal are about the same. I usually start with like about a 2Q on stuff. Um, Another, idea here is that like in terms of like these numbers, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what this number means, but just sort of by definition, like a 2Q is it's, not too wide, it's not too narrow. It's kind of like your starting point Q. Just for me, it's a good place to start. Um, if in mastering sometimes, and sometimes in sound design, I have to get really narrow, but like uh, you know, the capabilities we have in the digital realm to be able to have cues up to 16, super narrow, it's pretty rare that I find myself needing to do that. So it's just a little reminder that, like, just because we have the ability to do it doesn't necessarily mean we need to. Kind of like the way that we do have the ability to get this 48 dB slope, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. To me, this is going to sound better across multiple tracks. The occasional time when I really need to drastically do some removal, it's there and that's handy. But like I said, 80 to 90% of the time, I'm able to achieve what I want there. Just like 80 to 90% of the time, oops, wrong one. 80 to 90% of the time, I'm able to achieve with a 2 to 4Q, 1 to 4Q kind of a thing. Uh, I can go narrower, especially as I mentioned. If I'm going to be boosting, I'll try a little bit on the more narrow or a little bit on the wider side of the Q. Um, but anyway, just a quick little sort of tidbit on Q. And as a result of that, I lost my place. I'm talking about 2 to 4.5K. So let's see if I've got that documented somewhere in here. I think I do. Yeah. So there's this hat tambourine sound that I needed to take a little bit of that frequency range away from. Yeah. So without this, it sounds like a pretty decent sort of hat slash tambourine sound. I'll turn it up a little bit. And again, I'm just keeping this in solo so we can kind of get a sense of the frequency. But when I take a little bit away in this area, the removal of this, that sort of grating harshness that lives in this area, almost makes it sound like a better sample, makes it sound more hi-fi. That removal there allows me to hear the body that's coming from this low mids, and even some of this, the mid range and low mids. Lets me sort of hear some of the openness that's on the high end by doing this bit of removal in that particular frequency range. So that's this sort of quality that I'm listening for in something. And if I think, oh, that sounds a little bit harsh, then I'll try this, sort of 2 to 4K type of a range. And this is yeah, I mean the production session is too big to open, the computer won't handle it, but you'd see some removal in this on, a lot of the tracks. A lot. Probably 60 to 70%. There's 4 or 5 different hi-hats, there's 3 or 4 different claps, there's a couple of synth sounds, there's some vocals. There's probably a decent amount of removal across a bunch of those in varying amounts. Some might be just taking away 1 dB, some might be 4, but um, that frequency range is an interesting one. when I find myself hearing it like that harshness. So this frequency range of 7.5K, when I hear something that to me feels harsh but also pointy, so it feels like sharp, I guess. Um, it leads me to try to deal with what's happening at 7.5K. Now, this 7.5K has been a really fun frequency for me too, because in a similar effect of like that the 160, where I talked about how some removal there, the way that it opens up the low mids and the lows and sort of makes the low end sound rounder and more clear by just sort of getting rid of that 160, which is like sort of this weird audio illusion. It feels like I uh, actually added low end to it, but I took away 160. So this 7.5K does a really, really nice, very pleasing thing to audio, to brightness in sounds, claps, snares, hats, vocals. Lots of different things that sort of live in that range from anywhere 1K up to 16K. Taking a listen to what happens with some removal around 7.5K. Now, my initial uh, I guess, sort of awareness of this idea and this particular frequency and what it does came off of this hardware piece I was using for a while and had this button on it that I loved, and it was this warmth button. And I would sort of hit that warmth button and dial it in, and I would watch the little warmth meter go. And I was like, that sounds amazing. But being the nerd that I am, I needed to know why. What is it doing? So in reading the manual, they basically talked about what was the natural frequency result of tape machines, of the both the electronics and the physics of tape and the magnetics. And what was happening was that there was a natural softening in this 7.5K range. And that's part of the thing that contributed to this whole idea that, tape and analog sounded so much nicer, prettier, less harsh, right? So understanding that that's what I was liking about this unit, that was basically a frequency dependent compressor, I was able to, um, you know, start to really sort of dial in and listen to this frequency a lot. Um, so anyway, when I find myself thinking that the sound is not just harsh, but it feels harsh and pointy, like sharp. That leads me to think somewhere around this 7.5K. But this works really well, like I said, mess around with it on high end elements. You know, claps, snares, hats, all that type of stuff, vocals. So we can see a little bit of that on, I think it's that same, might be that same tambourine thing. Let's see here, 2K, 16K. Where did I put that guy? Yeah, 7.5K, different hat. So this is one of the many hats I have in this project. Just your basic kind of 808 hat, I think. Which sounds like an 808 hat straight off the bat with no EQ on it. But that's that sharpness I'm talking about at 7.5K. Can you kind of hear that? And it sounds decent like that. But when I do a little bit of that removal at 7.5, it sounds just to me like a better quality sound. I feel the impact of the 2K-ish, all that stuff that's happening below the 7K. The airiness up top is more present. It's sort of like I said, it has that similar approach to where it feels like it's a brighter sound, smoother, softer, nicer sounding sound. So it's all those type of words and meanings that if I feel like, oh, I want that to be nicer, or I want that to sound smoother, high end, I'll try a little bit of this removal in this 7.5K range because it works pretty nice. The similar idea is jumping up to this 9.5K. And my definition on this is that something starts to sound whistly is the way that I describe it. I'm not even sure that's a word, but When I've got oftentimes I'll hear this frequency on things with movement, so like 16th note hats, tambourine shakers, and stuff. We can sometimes hear some of this whistly going on, or just an overall, whistly effect on the sound. Um, the other thing too is that for my 7.5K and also for this 9.5K, I'm using a bit more of a narrower Q. So whereas on a lot of these other frequencies up until this point, I'm talking about this sort of 2 EQ Q setting for the EQ. Whereas once I get into the 7.5K and higher, I'm usually coming up a little bit more narrow to focus in, I guess, in that removal. The, the if we think about some of the hand gestures I've done over the last few days where I've talked about the way the low end moves like this, it takes up a lot of space, and then the mid range is kind of like this, and then we have the high end, right? You sort of see how like this is shorter and narrower, this is a little bit wider, and this is really wide. So it's sort of like, this is the sort of implementation of that frequency idea as I'm applying it in the EQ realm. So once I get up here, a lot of times I'm a little bit more narrow in some cases. So okay, so this whistly area, I think it's on that same hat, the example of the whistle part is this sort of 9.5K range. Sorry, I was moving the wrong thing. Yeah, this 8.8 sort of exemplifies it there, but somewhere right around this 9.5. It can start to take on kind of um, like I described, like it starts to take on a bit of like a whistle sound. It almost sounds like somebody is talking and whistling their S's if you've ever heard someone do that, um, either on purpose or that's just the way they speak. But it sort of has this little bit of a grating kind of whistle sound to it. And that's sort of what I hear when I think about this frequency range. Um, it's not quite as dramatic result as when I really, when I take a look at this 7.5 frequency range. But again, if I hear something feeling or sounding like it has a sort of whistle quality to it, that just sort of helps guide me to try to search for it and try to figure out what might be wrong, what I'm hearing, and how to fix it. From there, um, I think about the upper frequency range and this sort of above 16K range, the high end, really high end. The sort of area that people talk about is being um, the air, like people throw that around. There's even, the Air EQ plug-in by Mag with an Air band, which focuses the really high end. And anyway, I digress. But so this high frequency, really high frequency area, uh, in the last few years, I think it's had a similar effect to where I was talking about the way the sound designers, content creators make really full sounds so that we choose them and then we go back and buy more of their sounds and packs. And in the last few years, the mediums of creating music as well as consuming music and listening to music, the headphones have gotten better and better, speakers have gotten better and better. And of course, we're not actually playing vinyl, which couldn't handle a lot of high end just by the nature of it. So you couldn't be as bright. You weren't listening as bright as we can now. And so people have filled up the frequency range. And so we sometimes end up with this similar effect, as I mentioned, where we're choosing cool sounding sounds because they're both have the warmth that we like in that 2 to 400 range, and they also have the brightness in this 16K really high end stuff. And then we start to layer multiple sounds from multiple instruments and multiple samples from multiple places, and we can start to have this extra build up. And so it's a little bit hard to pick out, but the way I sort of define this upper, really high end stuff is if it starts to sound sizzly or like sizzling bacon, like it's a little crispy sounding. in the really, really high end. So if I find myself going, oh, it seems like it's a little bit weird up there, um, where it sounds sizzly, then it will sort of lead me to try to look for something and try some removal up in that really high end, really, really high end area. Now, it's not so much, it's not really all that important to try to treat the high end like we treat the low end, mainly because as we've covered numerous times, the low end just takes up a lot of length and time and space and volume, and so therefore we get rid of the excess that's lingering so that we can create that clarity. But it has a similar effect in that even though they're not taking up a lot of space in the frequencies are very close together and they're moving very quickly to one another, that when there is a lot of it going on, all different rhythms and things, there can be a sort of frequency masking that's happening up there in a sense. And that's not even necessarily something that I can hear, like frequency masking, but the result of it is if I start to hear something that sort of sounds like it's sizzling, and it's sort of the result of too many frequencies combating for the same range, too close together, and almost sort of creating this phasing effect that it's hard to pick out as phasing, but it comes across as something kind of feels like it's sizzling up there. And so I might then try to track out what's the part element that's causing it by turning some tracks off and see if it goes away. And then if I find the track that seems to be making it kind of weird, then I would try a little bit of removal up in that frequency range. So um, the removal approach up there can also be sometimes having a think about the intentionality up there as well. So, I talked about my approach to mixing being very intentional, where like I only want the things in the low end that I want there, and I think about some of the other frequencies and where I want stuff placed, and that I want to, apply the compression with the low end removed already, so that we're being very diligent about how we're setting that up. I also talked about doing setting the makeup gain and bypassing the plugin and really analyzing what's happening. In other words, being very intentional about every move I make across the mixing process. And again, I want to think about the frequency range and the intention of the parts themselves and how they are meant to contribute for the high end. Because sometimes I might have somebody created a kick drum that has this, really super high end a part of the attack part of a kick drum that in my particular song, when layered with a bunch of synths up there, maybe even some weird area effects on vocals, some other parts that have that already, I might want to really think about if that's necessary from that particular, for example, I'm using kick. Um, so just like some of the other frequency ranges where I was using a more traditional EQ with a Q involved, like with a 2Q or the examples I was using. And I can do that also for this above 16K. But I can also do that with a bit of a shelf where I'm just sort of dipping a little bit above this setting here, 15K minus 3 dB with a default Q is just sort of putting a little bit of a taper to some of the high end. Um, and then if I'm really to the point where I'm thinking like, the high end on this particular piece just doesn't really make sense, it's getting in the way, then using a actual high cut or low pass filter can help, shave some of that off to get it out of the way and leave room for what I want, depending on where I set it. And again, this is all like the usage scenario here has to start with me hearing something wrong. That hearing something wrong translates to some sort of a definition, which then leads me to go and search it out, right? So that's the sort of like Sherlock Holmes type process that goes on within a few seconds in my head. But it's like something's wrong. Where do I hear it wrong? What is the definition? What does it sound like? Now here's where I need to go look for it. So then from there, how do I get rid of it and how do I address it? these two ways can often help me do that. So again, I just wanted to clarify that I'm not saying, throw a shelf on, take away 3 dBs on everything on your high end. It's like, if I feel like something sounds a little sizzly and I want to do it, here's the approach that either one of these will help do that. The high and low pass filter stuff is sort of reiterated in here in the context of EQ. But basically, we've already covered that pretty diligently with the fact that a 12 dB slope is taking 12 dBs down over the course of 1 octave. What is 1 octave in our EQ terms? That's half the frequency. Or if it's a low pass, a low pass filter or a high cut filter, it's double the frequency, 12 dBs over double the frequency. So the filter Q control, we also, I believe, yeah, we definitely covered that. This is pretty useful. I don't think that I have this in here, but if we note, oh yeah, so here's an interesting scenario, right? So if we see kind of what's happening here, this is similar to something that I've already kind of talked about. And it was the very first trick I was talking about with the low end, where I had this sort of shelf slash filter going on to put some focus to the low end. So there's a similar effect that can occur using just the high pass filter. So if I turn this shelf off and I've got this high pass slash low cut filter and I adjust the Q here, I can put a little bit of an emphasis around this frequency area. Now it is a little different if you notice. The shelved version of this, I can define where I want this to start by changing the frequency of that shelf, right? So I can put the emphasis in how much of the emphasis I want, and I can adjust that. But sometimes just being able to sort of rock this cue around can help fine tune what it is I'm trying to approach. So um, I would say the most often way that I use this cue on a filter is when I'm addressing something, for example, like that keyboard sound where I'm trying to get rid of the lows, but be respectful of the low mids and the warmth, but also try to sort of dial that in a way that is really appropriate. So when I take a look at this synth key, which we've already talked about a few times, or shown this a few times, but one example where this would be a handy sort of tool is that, like, I would start, let's say, getting rid of somewhere up around in here, and I feel like, okay, that's cool, but I want to get a little bit more lows out of it. Then I'll just sort of rock this cue down a little. If you notice, like as I go this way, it softens that curve. And so it gives me the ability to sort of take just a little bit more out around that frequency. So um, it's sort of it's almost like the knee control kind of a thing on an EQ, where it gives me the ability to fine tune what's happening right around that frequency. Um, so I'm still letting the amount of lows through that I do want, and taking away the amount of lows that I want, and all that. But this allows me to just sort of taper that in there. And my usage of this, like I said, is often on elements that do have some low mids, and I do want to figure out and where to put that and how I want that to sit with everything else. I don't want to just necessarily, move this up and just keep taking away out of this range. I just may want to taper this here. So I'll leave this where I had it and then use the cue to kind of taper around there. And notice how it's a little bit more smoother approach to what's going on. It's still leaving some of this lows. It's just a matter of me adjusting how much of that I want. And so this is a handy tool when it's available. And pretty much most, I mean, I know mics and Logic, so your filters got this as well. So, um, but it's the application of it is what is kind of cool to think about. And that's where I find myself using it a lot. And with that same approach, I'll use it occasionally on the high end when I am trying to do a little bit of removal to make some space out there, or something seems to be maybe just a little bit too bright, where I can do that, and then I can also, taper how that's approached, and or also put a little emphasis around there, depending on what I'm doing. So it's subtle combo tool to be able to kind of think about when I'm trying to shape the high end or the low end, but my most of the time I'm using it to adjust this somewhere around where I'm trying to deal with this low mids. I do find myself going, you know what, let me take a little bit more of that away. And so it's just that little bit more gentle removal rather than bringing the frequency up. So it still allows me to have some of that extra low end that I want to feel in there, but just taper right around that point. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. What, what I'm talking about. So the basic idea of the workflow here is uh, I've talked about a bunch today that like I have these definitions that sort of help me guide me to an area to look for something that I want to, address. How I'm addressing that is sort of laid out in these couple of steps here. The important part, I'm going to talk about the way that the cue and the gain work when I'm going through this idea of trying to check for a sound or try to fix a sound, as the case may be, right? So this ties into what I mentioned earlier that just because I can have a really narrow cue doesn't necessarily mean I should. But this queue goes up to 16. I think Logic's queue goes up to 100. But like a queue of around 10 or 12 is narrow enough for me to get a sense of what's happening at a certain frequency, but not too narrow to where everything is going to sound messed up. So oftentimes I'm even, using a queue of 8 with a little bit of gain, like, 8 or 10 dBs of gain, and then I'm using the frequency to sweep it around to try to find what it is, right? So at first I say, "Oh, there's something about this area that I want to address," and then I have to go find it. And so I'll narrow my approach now by going, "Oh, let's just say it was around that 7.5K range. It sounded kind of pointy or sharp. So I'll sort of rock this around that 7.5K range to figure it out." Now, if I do 15 dBs a gain and a 16 Q, it doesn't matter what frequency I go at, it's going to sound totally messed up. And so I'm not going to be able to, it's not going to be very useful to me. Whether I'm soloing the frequency or not, it just doesn't really, work for me. In fact, more often than not, soloing the frequency in a mixed contest doesn't even usually, uh, in a mixed context, the soloing of the frequency sometimes is hard for me to really pick out too because it's giving me a little bit of a false representation because I start my process again where I think oh, there's something that I want to fix here. I define it a little bit to help narrow where I'm going to look. So oh, it's kind of pointy. All right, so I think that's around 7.5K. It's hard for me to make sense of it. My preferred way is to have a moderate amount of gain, a moderate Q, where it's, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there, about 8, 9, 10 dBs of gain, and then move that frequency around. So it's less like, well, it's less drastic of both gain and cue, and therefore I can just sort of focus my listening and try to listen for the emphasis of what it was I didn't like. And that's what I'm going for here, right? So I've seen YouTube videos where people are like this, or and they show you how to do this and use this or whatever. But like, okay, cool, I get it, I know how to use it, but like the idea that I want to present is that I'm looking for the emphasis of what it was that I didn't like. So again, go back a few steps. My first step is, oh, something I don't like about that. It sounds harsh. So I might think 2K, 4K range, set this up. And now I'm going to listen for the emphasis of what it was I didn't like. And that now defines the frequency area that I want to address. And then addressing it, like I said, normally 2Q, take away a couple dBs, whatever the case may be, not 23, but maybe 3, and then sort of see how that plays out and how that works. But so that workflow right there, my old school used to call it boost, hunt, kill, right? So you sort of boost the frequency a little bit, you hunt around by moving the frequency, so you have some gain, the boost. You hunt around by moving this till you find the area that you want, and then you sort of get rid of it. So that's sort of subtractive EQ in like a quick little uh, sort of workflow. I don't know what you'd call it, but 3 words: boost, hunt, kill. Um, but anyway, so that's just a thing. I've sat with students before, and they've been like, this narrow queue, and then all the way up, and then also, soloing, and it's like, dude, what are you? what frequency are you looking for? They all sound fucked up. Like everything's going to sound messed up. So it's just a workflow idea here. The next step of this workflow idea that's in here is to make sure that I'm soloing and I'm listening to the track and I'm not just looking at the spectrum analyzer. So I've had this happen to me numerous times where I think to myself, like I'm trusting my definition part. And so I hear something and I go, oh, it's kind of sounds harsh. So I think it's probably 2K. I look at the spectrum analyzer, I see some sort of boost there. I just sort of go exactly there, take it away. And then I kind of go, nah, that wasn't really what I was hearing. Right. So I definitely try to make sure that I'm not being misled by the spectrum analyzer. I want to sometimes utilize the spectrum analyzer to help guide me with what I'm doing, but I also want to make sure that I'm not letting my eyes totally fool me. So um, that's just a quick little sort of my reminder to not just rely on the spectrum analyzer, to utilize it, and certainly it's useful, but not 100%. The next thing is that I want to make sure and emphasize that I do my sort of initial finding of the EQ. I'll solo for that, and I'll even start to make some adjustments. For example, like what I did here, like go, okay, I'm listening to this. I'll boost a few dBs. I'll make it kind of narrow. I'll sweep around and then go, oh, okay, that's the area. Then I'll bring it back wide a bit, take a couple dBs away, kind of play with that, maybe even play with this, and I'll definitely make sure that I'm now not in solo and I'm listening to the track and I'm moving this stuff around a little bit more and really see and really make sure that that's the part that I want to address. This idea of this taking it that one step further of kind of like thinking about what I want to address, soloing it, finding that frequency, doing some basic adjustment, and then fine tuning that adjustment in context of everything has really saved me a lot. It's usually allowed me to not be as drastic or as heavy-handed with what EQ I'm doing, because oftentimes it'll take a little bit less to achieve the sound that I'm going for, when I'm doing those adjustments in context of everything else. Because there's other frequencies going on, there's other things happening, there's interaction of all the other tracks of frequencies that are happening, that sometimes just a little bit in a certain area off this one track starts to now allow the feeling that I'm going for, or the frequency definition I want in a certain area to come through. Whereas if I'm just soloing a track, I'm usually going to be a bit more heavy-handed with what I'm taking away or adding or whatever the case may be. And so that's just a little, the idea here is to think about not too narrow of a cue and not too much gain, to find the frequency and then do a little bit of work on it in solo, because that's obviously useful to focus your listening, especially at this stage of the game. But then also do some understanding of that adjustment and its impact, not in solo. And so that's been definitely useful for me to remember. And I have to remember myself because it is easy just to sort of solo scoop this around and go, yeah, I hate that frequency, and then do what I need to do to get rid of it. And then all of a sudden look back and go, oh, that sounds a little weird. So it's just sort of little tip to remind you on that. Solo and in context. So um yeah, so that's pretty much it. There's some more stuff here at the bottom. I know we don't really have much time left, but yeah, spectrum analyzers, I sort of covered that already. Um, so this is this last little bit, I think, has some good tips here for getting into some of the low end, like we talked about. And I kind of already really went into this, where I talked about putting some focus on the low end and thinking of like that 50 to 100 as being the main area where I want my low end to be. And that way that I can sometimes tighten up the low end by using the high pass filter, even on kicks and subs. So I pretty much, covered this. Um, and the way that I, even just sort of using it pretty low, like at 30 hertz, can sometimes just put a little bit of tightening up on the parts that I do want to be on the low end, but maybe sometimes feel a little floppy or feel a little bit boomy, as I was mentioning earlier. Um, and then I just sort of talked a little bit here about the slopes, which we have a pretty good understanding of now. And there was a trick that I was saying how you could make a 12 dB slope by setting up or sorry, you could make a 24 dB slope by setting up uh, two 12 dB slopes at the same frequency. So if I just show you that really quickly, if if I think, okay, well, this is my 12 dB slope filter, the standard one, right? And I set that at, let's just say 160, default Q. And then I think, yeah, that sounds okay, but I want a little bit heavier. Then I can make it a 24 dB slope filter by just setting it at the same, same frequency, same Q, and another 12 dB slope filter now turns that into a 24 dB slope filter. Now, again, a 24 dB slope filter does what? It takes away 24 dBs over the course of one octave. So this would be a cool approach if my 12 dB slope was cool, but I felt like I wanted a little bit more. 4 times that, obviously, we know is extremely drastic, and that might not be what I need. It might sound kind of synthetic once I do that, but the doubling up of the two to make a 24 dB slope filter can often be useful. Some third-party tools, which is what I was showing here, in this one of my favorite EQs, but it's third-party EQ, has a 24 dB slope, easily accessible. Um, yeah, and I actually talked about this sort of low end cleanup. Yeah, I actually did some reorganizing on this, so I've already covered it, but I left it in here because it's also kind of EQ. But the whole idea that, like, when I'm going through my low end cleanup, like I said, my goal is to make sure that the really low frequencies below 100-ish, or even below like 50, 60, below 100, are cleaned up. So if I'm dealing with a synth sound or a snare or a hi-hat or something, and once I get up this far, I'm good. Like, I don't have to really try to finesse this and figure out if this is better than this or this is better than. My goal on this is to make sure my low end is clear. So once I get up in here and it's not, like, it's fine, the sound isn't changing weirdly, then I just leave it and move on other elements where there is this frequency range, where I have to sort of finesse this here. The way I do it and the way I think about it and define it is that I'll set my high pass or my low cut filter, and I'll make the adjustment until the sound starts to sound thin. And so if I think to myself, like, oh, that sounds too thin, then I just sort of back off a little bit. And that's where I can help sort of rock this around. But that's pretty much how it goes. I set it up, I move it. Oh, that sounds thin. I back off a little. So I let a little bit more of the part back in that allows it to sound more full, knowing that I've got my removal that I need on this, low end here. And that's, kind of the workflow idea, but I know I already covered it, but I just reiterate that. So boom, 2 minutes to spare again. Any thoughts or questions about any of this? I know we covered a lot today, and you're probably going to want to play around with these and see how they make sense to you. But there's some cool tips and tricks and frequency areas that are going to be helpful, I think. But any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, just a general question. Apart from using the utility as a mono for bass,
Yeah.
how do you use the utility VST? And you personally?
Yeah, me personally, I mean, I just use it for, like, if I need to do, something. I have it here on my master, to reduce some gain, just because I'm sending to you guys audio, so it's quick gain adjustment if I need to. But I would say the majority of the time I'm using it on the low end individual tracks for this bass mono part right here. That's the most handy part of this. I use that more. Um, I'm usually, most of my gain staging is pretty well established in thinking and workflow, so I don't usually end up where I have to use this to solve a gain staging problem, except for gain staging sending to Zoom so you guys can hear me and the mix. And so I use it there as a gain utility, simply. But most of the time I'm using just this low end thing here. I mean, this is pretty cool. I mean, this is a mid-side processor that's happening here, where it has the ability to process the mono information, or what's called the mid, not mid-range, but middle mono, and then the sides beating the more stereo information, the information that's kind of different in the left and the right. If it's the same in the left and the right, technically it's a mono signal. It comes out of both speakers, but it comes out the same. So with that understanding, this width knob can be kind of funky sometimes, where like, let's say I'm on this synth and I'm thinking to myself, what'll it sound like if I put a little bit of, if I put a little bit of width on this synth? So I can play with this to put a little bit of width on it if I want. Oh, that's not working like I thought for some reason. Am I on the right track? Maybe it's because I'm only hearing mono. Anyway, it's interesting to play around with and see if it's helpful for what you're doing. That didn't really do what I was thinking, so it could have something to do with the Zoom thing or whatever. But there is a bit of a mid-side width thing here where you can actually increase the width, push a little bit of stereo-ness on a sound. But the majority of the time, I'm using the utility for this low-end mono. Set somewhere around here, 100-ish type area.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. You'll get the video, you'll get the notes. See you tomorrow. Bye.